Good evening, everyone. I hope you're doing well. It's now been just over 6 months since the Australian federal government introduced the 5% first home buyers deposit scheme to help people go into life crippling debt to enter the real estate mega hyper bubble. And it does help some people outside of first home buyers, but generally speaking, it's going to first home buyers. So let's have a look. We've got from October 1st, when the scheme was introduced, to the 31st of March. We've got some data on, and credit to Tarek Brooker, avid commentator. There's his social media handle there, his Substack. I've grabbed this particular chart from him, so please give him the credit. But first up, let's have a look at the government news channel, the Communist News, ABC News, to make sure that we're not getting our facts wrong. Now, the government is citing Treasury Department modelling. So this was back in August of 2025, just before the scheme was introduced, that suggests the total impact on housing prices will be around 0.5% increase after 6 years. So not 6 years, it's only been 6 months, right? So it's been 1/12 the amount of time. Now, the government's probably talking about overall home prices. Now, Sydney and Melbourne, keep in mind we have a massive real estate mega hyper bubble like no other country in the modern era has, maybe Japan in the 80s. Anyway, let's focus on this data. Sydney, so the blue or turquoise, I don't quite know what color that is. I'm not good with art, but homes that qualify for the 5% deposit scheme, so helping people who couldn't qualify for a loan to buy a house. There were certain price caps the government put in, and we'll look at those in a sec. Homes that were eligible went up 4.1% in Sydney, while other homes that were too expensive to be part of the government scheme actually dropped 1.1% in price. So the government managed to make the homes as part under their scheme go up 5% more. This is in 6 months. 6 months, not a year, not 5 years. And remember, the government said that over a 6 year period, homes would only go up 6%. In Melbourne, not much of a change there. Melbourne and Victoria is a whole other story, but I acknowledge that the first two, not a ridiculous amount of change. But let's have a look now at Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth. Look at Brisbane. Homes have gone up, homes that are not part of the scheme up 10%. This is in 6 months. 13% increase, 13.3% increase in homes that were eligible for the 5% deposit scheme. Does this sound like the government making homes more affordable? I understand the goal was to get people into homes, but what about all the people who are, not wealthy and don't qualify for this scheme? Maybe they bought a home 5 years ago and now they've had to move city for a job, or maybe man and woman have met each other and they've decided to move in together. They were both living with mum and dad, or they both lived with previous partners. They need to buy an affordable home. Well, thank you, Australian federal government, for making those homes go up 13% in 6 months. Adelaide, not quite as bad. Perth, ridiculous. 18.2% increase in 6 months versus 14.6% of homes that don't qualify. So homes massively going up in price, pumping the bubble, getting people into massive debt. And we'll look at that in a sec. So this is from the 13th of April from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. First home buyers, 16% increase in the dollar amount of mortgages issued to first home buyers. And if we scroll down here, we can see this is a chart from the RBA. And what we're looking at here is the number of people. So see the dotted line here is when the scheme started, and this 90% or above. So keep in mind, if you're on the 5% deposit scheme and you take full advantage of it, that means you have to borrow 95% of the price of the home. So you've almost borrowed the entire amount. The government doesn't give you 15%. They just act as a backstop there, so you can get the loan, you can qualify for the loan in case something goes wrong. You don't have to pay the mortgage insurance, mortgage lender's insurance, whatever. Now you can see the spike in the number of people that are borrowing 90% or more of the value of the property to buy it, almost 50%. So almost half the people that took out a new loan borrowed more than, so first home buyers, sorry, we're talking about this scheme. Nearly half the people are borrowing more than 90% of the value of the property. So they've taken on massive debts, massive debts. And if we have a look at, this is from housingaustralia.gov.au, and we have a look at the property price cap. So in the earlier graph, we looked at the homes that are eligible for the scheme versus homes that aren't. And we can see the government as of 1st of October, 2025, in New South Wales, if you're in Sydney, you could buy a $1.5 million home. Now, look at Queensland, Brisbane, 1 million, right? These are So we'll have a look at how much debt people have potentially taken on. I've tried to do a couple of hours of research and break down, how much debt people took on as part of the scheme versus people not part of the scheme. I couldn't separate the data, and I want to make sure I'm being as accurate as possible. But the banks have, because we're in a massive inflation environment, so prior to October, the RBA has increased rates multiple times since the government brought this scheme in, and most people would have gone on variable rate loans because that's the norm in Australia. Again, I couldn't get data on that, but it would be fair to say that the majority of the people that took part of the scheme are on variable rates, or if they're on fixed rates, they won't be on fixed rates for long. Interest rates have gone up, right? And the banks are now, so the RBA is expected to raise rates a few more times. The Iran war is not helping the potential fuel shortages. And then the research from realestate.com.au, sorry, from this other group, this other real estate group. Anyway, we won't worry about what the name is for now. This Miss Tyndall from, I forget where she's from, but that the banks have increased by 0.43% on the rate of interest they charge on a home loan since the last RBA decision. That suggests banks are factoring more than one additional cash rate rise. Yes, they are. And we can have a look at some of those rates. So, the lowest fixed rates, they're still all above 6% for the big banks. So anyone who took on a fixed rate probably did so at a higher than 6%. And keep in mind, these rates are just general rates. Because for some of these rates, you have to, you can't borrow 95%. You can only borrow 60 or 70%. You have to have a larger deposit. So LVR requirements apply, as noted there in the fine print. And then, of course, variable rates, again, and we'll have a look at CBA in a sec, but these variable rates, they look like they're 5.5%, but in reality, someone who's, this police bank's offering it at 5.66%, but these other rates are for people that are only borrowing 60 or 70%, meaning they need to come up with a 30 to 40% deposit. Let's move it along, because let's have a look at Commonwealth Bank and their mortgage repayment calculator. Let's do because there are a lot of people in Sydney who would have taken advantage of the scheme. Let's say you took on you can buy up to $1.5 million home. So you might have taken on $1.4 million of debt for a 30-year loan to buy a house in Sydney. And if we have a look at the rates, see some of these rates here are in the 5 and low 6%, but notice the LVR, the loan to value ratio, 70 or 80%. That means you have to have a 20 or 30% deposit. So you would not, if you're using this scheme, you probably didn't get that rate. Now, I understand banks offer deals and that a lot of people probably did get cheaper rates, but let's just have a look at, keep in mind, the RBA is very likely to raise interest rates maybe another 2, 3, possibly 4 more times, depending on how bad this conflict gets. See this rate here, if you're borrowing 90 to 95%, right? And we had a look at that RBA chart that nearly half the people are borrowing 90% or more. If you're at CBA, you're paying 7.49% interest, right? So you're going to be paying $2.1 million interest over the course of that loan. Again, if the goal is to make houses more affordable, and the government achieves the opposite. Yes, they've helped some people get into a house who couldn't previously get a loan, but how well off are these people now that interest rates are going up and they've taken on these massive debts to buy the most expensive real estate in the history of Australia, possibly in the history of modern planet Earth, right? These ridiculous amounts of money. And if you do the calculations on that, without going too deep into, calculating mortgage repayments, we can all agree that at the start of the loan, you're paying much more in interest than you are in principal. So the first couple of years, you're barely paying down any principal. If you've borrowed, let's say you've got in on this 5% deposit scheme, you've borrowed a massive amount of money, you've paid interest, you've barely paid off a little bit of the principal, and then 2 or 3 years later, husband and wife break up, or you need to move to another city for a different job, whatever the situation may be. What if the house has gone down in price? I know in Australia we don't think real estate can drop in price, but it can. And I'm going to show you some examples in Canada and New Zealand. Firstly, this is a graph that goes back to the late 80s or mid 80s house price to income ratios. So how many years of income do you need to buy a house? Have a look at where Australia was back in the mid 90s. In 1996, you needed about 3.5 times your annual income to buy a home in Australia. Now you need 9.7, right? And I agree with this graph that this is in the impossibly unaffordable area. And New Zealand got up there too, and now they're down to 7.7 because the real estate market in New Zealand has declined by about 30%, as it has in Canada, about 28%, depending on how you want to measure it, what your source is. In America, they only pay 4.8 times income for a house. I understand there are other factors and other ways to measure this, but Australian real estate, it is decades overdue for a significant decline. And of course, in Australia, so this is not a video about immigration or the migration levels, but I will acknowledge that I'm not philosophically opposed to it. I just will acknowledge the math that we've brought in lots of people, and I'm sure you're aware that a lot of Australians are upset at the levels of migration. They want it slashed, and this is what happened in Canada. They cut. We'll have a look at some quick stats, right, to show you. This is the population of Canada, quarterly change, right? And we can start to see that in 2020, end of 2025, and then early 2026, they allowed the population to drop, and it was starting to, the rate of increase was starting to decline. And Canada's real estate market dropped about 28% from the peak in 2022. Now, but we'll have a look at the rentals, because all you landlords out there think, oh, I'm just going to be able to keep jacking up my rent. Doesn't matter if interest rates go up and I'm negatively geared, or the housing prices stop growing, jack up my rent. I've talked to landlords about this. Well, have a look at rents in Canada, right? Rents from 2024, in fact, that would have been late 2024, because that would have been the last quarter. Notice the annual rate of decline in rents, but 2, 3, 4% at some point. It doesn't mean it's declining by 4% a quarter, but the point is, even in an inflation environment, rents have fallen in Canada, and you can see compared to Australia, this is rents in Australia just going up, 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 and rents in Canada peaked around 2024, and now they're down about 10% or so. Imagine an Australian landlord collectively across the country, everyone dropping their rents by 10%. I mean, people think that can't happen. And and New Zealand too, another similar economy to ours. They've had prices fall by 30% in inflation adjusted terms. So the actual decline is probably closer to 20% in dollar terms, but adjusted for inflation, 30%. In fact, it's since 2019, so maybe it's a little bit less than that. But I agree with adjusting it for inflation. And, if we have, you might think, well, New Zealand must have really high interest rates. No, in 2024, the New Zealand Central Bank had interest rates at 5.5%. They've been dropping them. They're down to 2.25%. They have not raised interest rates like Australia has. What happened was people are leaving the country because the economy there sucks. And then in Canada, same thing. Interest rates are at 5% in Canada, and now they're at 2.25%. Canada has not increased interest rates a single time since they started cutting in 2024, yet their real estate market is down, rents are falling, they have inflation. Same with New Zealand. I'm on the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's website. You might say, well, maybe the reason prices declined in New Zealand is no inflation in New Zealand. Well, the central bank says there's 3.1% inflation year on year for the past year. And New Zealand has had a similar, maybe a little bit lower than Australia, but still a similar rate of inflation, positive, not that it's a good thing, but positive rate of inflation. Right. So, so again, the government is the worst way to do something, right? Like, how does it make homes more affordable? There are people, not everyone is on this deposit scheme, so when you make the price of these homes go up, you make the price of it. So yes, okay, the government will say, oh, we got, people into houses, right? Well, was that good? Maybe they were renting somewhere, and now you've turned them into an eternal debt slave. They're going to pay what, $2 million potentially. Now I know this will change. 30 years is a long time, but right now, based on the data we have, this person could potentially pay $2 million in interest. Total repayments of $3.5 million to buy a $1.5 million home in Sydney that is already ridiculously overpriced. Now, I understand a lot of people would have bought cheaper homes. Maybe they bought apartments or whatever. I'm highlighting. But what about people who, again, not on the scheme and are just buying the average home in Sydney, right? The average home in Sydney is a little bit more than 1.5 million, And then just because this is a hot topic at the moment, for those of you who still think, oh, well, we need the government to do something about housing affordability. We need them to work on it. The government's there to help us. They got to work on stuff. Well, have a look at what they said about, have a look at the NDIS, and the blue bars are in 2015. So initially when they introduced the program in 2011, Their forecast was for the program to cost $13.5 billion per year by the time it matured. Now, by 2015, I guess they'd realized that they'd botched the numbers and that it was going to be a bit more expensive than that. So you can see, so the red is the 2022 expectation. So they thought by initially in 2015, it might be a little bit hard to see on this chart. I'm going to zoom in. In 2015, they thought in this financial year that the NDIS would cost about $22 billion. And so far this year, it's estimated to cost $52 billion. So they were off by about double. It was double the cost of what they thought it was going to be. And then by 2022, 2023, I guess they figured out it was going to cost a little bit more. They did probably forecast it a bit more accurately back then. I don't know if they're doing calendar years. I assume that would be financial years. But they're thinking that by 2032, it's going to cost 130 billion, over 120 billion. So for a program that they initially thought was going to cost 13.5 billion once at full maturity, full implementation, just a little bit now, maybe they needed to adjust those for inflation. But, again, the government is just terrible at anything they do. And I'll finish up by focusing on this graph. Look at these home prices going up and tell me, does that look like the government is making homes more affordable for working class Australians? Yes, yes, people got in on the 5% scheme and maybe they were in a terrible situation in a rental, or they couldn't find a rental, or they were living with family or something. I understand that. But overall, for the entire country, so for people who don't qualify for the scheme, who are having to pay higher and higher prices and take on more and more debt at higher interest rates to buy houses, and then the people who got in on this 5% scheme, I wonder how some of them are feeling right now, struggling with a cost of living and an inflation rate that's going up. So everything else that isn't their mortgage is going up in price by more than the government told them it would go up, and by, and I would argue, an unacceptable rate. I'm sure we could all agree on that. But now, the mortgage costs, the interest on the mortgage. I'm going to leave it there. I've probably ranted enough on this. Hopefully, some interesting data there for you. I understand I'm presenting a negative view of it, and there is a little bit more to unpack. If we had 2 or 3 hours to talk about it, we could look at the other side of the story, and I acknowledge that it's probably done some good for some families. I'm not discounting that. But overall, again, government is terrible at everything it does, and I would argue that we'd be better off if they just stopped intervening. They're not building as many. They made it a priority to build more houses. They're falling short of those targets. They made it a priority to make housing more affordable. And I've shown in previous videos that rents in Australia have gone up 2 to 3 times the rate of overall inflation, and rents are a big part of that inflation. So rents are rising 2 or 3 times faster than inflation. They're going up 7 to 10% a year if we look at market rents, and housing prices are going up. Housing prices and housing costs are going up faster than the overall rate of inflation when the government is claiming that they're working on making it more affordable. That doesn't sound to me like they're doing a good job, and I don't know why we would want them to do almost any kind of job. Hope there was some informative stuff in here. Thank you for listening. Cheers.